Welcome back to Compass, finding spirituality in the everyday. You've probably heard of emotional intelligence, but what about spiritual intelligence? My name is Ryan Dunn, and on this episode of Compass, we meet up with Dr. Paul Burns and dive into things like brain development, emotional attachments, and spiritual journeys. Paul shares his personal experiences with panic attacks, parenting, and healing, revealing how these all impacted his emotional intelligence and how that then spurred him to address spiritual development in a similar manner. Reverend Dr. Paul Burns is the creator of the GPS Spiritual Inventory. He's coached ministry leaders, pastored churches, and written several books, including Blessing Encounters, and the book that we're talking about mostly today, Becoming Spiritually Intelligent. So join us as we explore this unique perspective on prayer, anxiety, and the complexities of human relationships and the human mind. That's next on Compass.
My soul is joyful and excited.
Wonderful. Any particular impulse that has you feeling so joyful or excited?
It's just one of those days. One, I get to talk with you and talk to people about something I'm passionate about. But later today, my church is going to have a neighborhood tailgate party I'm excited about. And when you're kind of living your purpose as best you can, I think that's where my joy and excitement comes from.
Cool. Well, you're excited to talk with us about spiritual intelligence. I spend a good amount of my work moderating comments on social media. There's definitely a predominant line of thinking out there in the culture at large where people would put together the word spiritual and intelligent and say, well, that doesn't work. You can't do that. You're one or the other. So tell us about spiritual intelligence. What are you meaning through spiritual intelligence?
Well, it really begins not so much with IQ intelligence. In fact, not at all IQ intelligence. It comes out of this thought of emotional intelligence, which is kind of came in the 90s and really has swept through the corporate world and little by little making its way into the church. But emotional intelligence is about understanding and managing your emotions so that you relate to people in good ways rather than in bad ways. And so spiritual intelligence is really a riff off of emotional intelligence to where now God is part of the equations. It's not just me and you, it's God and me and you, and how a relationship with God can inform the way we relate to other people. It really, another way you could say it is your ability to love, to receive and give love.
Okay. Part of our emotional intelligence is in recognizing how our attachments of the past, our early attachments, affect our relationships in the present. How do our early attachments affect our spiritual relationship, our relationship with God?
Well, that was really kind of my starting question. There's the question of why do some people believe, have faith, and other people don't? And my own tradition in the Presbyterian Church, our go-to answer is God chose you to believe. God gave you the gift of belief. And well, then why would God not give that to everybody? And so I began looking at that question and found that how do people develop to have the ability to have trusting, loving relationships in general? And it goes back to those early formational relationships as babies and children with our parents and other caregivers, and this thing that forms in us called attachment. And our attachment can be secure, which gives us a sense of that we are worthy of being loved and we can trust others to love us. And it gives us some foundation to have a loving, trusting relationship. But nobody has a totally secure attachment. Some people have insecure attachment to where they just want to push away when times get tough, and others want to really kind of codependently cling on, and unintentionally push people away. And so I began exploring attachment. And so that is, I think, if you do not have some sense that you are worthy of love and that you can trust others to love you, it would be very hard, I think, to be able to believe that God, an invisible being, could love you and you could trust this invisible being.
Yeah. This is a very different approach from a pastoral perspective that you're taking. Was there something going on in your own life that was kind of pushing along this new awakening or this new perspective that you were adopting?
Well, I mean, some of it is that theological question that I brought up is why, but also in my own, this really started in many ways with my own experience um, with panic attacks, which, started happening to me about 10 years ago. I was really trying to understand what was going on inside of me and, where did this come from? So I just began trying to understand my brain and my emotional life and how to get a handle on this thing and not just to cope with panic and anxiety, but to find a sense of healing. And so that understanding how humans develop and how trauma and grief can impact the development. And that's really kind of a starting place for me. And then raising children, we adopted a child and then a second child, and trying to understand how to best raise our children, how to give them a sense of security. So really, and it's a very personal work. I don't want to mess my kids up. I want to give
Yeah.
them, I want them to know that they're loved. I want to be
Every
a
parent's,
trustworthy.
yeah. Oh. Hmm. Has your work in spiritual intelligence impacted then your ability to, I get your sense in not wanting to use the word cope with the anxiety, but to process the anxiety?
Yeah, it has a lot. And I mean, with other things, I mean, therapy is a big part of I think, for me, developing spiritual intelligence. Being heard compassionately by another person is a path of healing. And so that's part of the healing part. But also, uh, you know, understanding how the brain works in a relational way. It's on the right side of the brain is the relational part of our brain. And when we're in when we're in an anxious state or feeling panicky, it feels very counterintuitive to want to reach out and connect with people. I just want to turn off the lights and close the door,
Hmm.
right? But it's actual relating to another person that restores our brain's sense of security and trust.
In your book, you talk quite a bit about brain development and how it impacts our interactions with the world. I didn't get any class like that in seminary. So what spurred this kind of learning that you had about all the brain development?
It's surprising that it actually was at a seminary.
Okay, tell me more.
I was doing a doctoral program, a Doctor of Ministry program that was focused on coaching. And I was doing faith coaching, life coaching, spiritual coaching, whatever you want to call it. And they had both a coaching department and a psychology department. And so part of our curriculum was some different authors, psychiatrists who wrote from a faith perspective and kind of connecting the dots of spirituality and brain science. Like Kurt Thompson is a person. He wrote a book called The Anatomy of the Soul, and it was a neuroscience neuro-informed explanation of spirituality from a Christian perspective. Some other people, there are people out there now called neurotheologians. There's a new word for you.
Yeah,
I don't know if
holy
I put
smokes.
myself in
Okay.
that category, but so I was learning it at seminary.
Okay. All right. And what are some of the surprising aha moments you've had in looking at that, or some of the learnings that you've taken away and how brain science has impacted spiritual growth?
Well, a couple of things I'll mention. One is, when it comes to the fear center of your brain, which, usually gets talked about as the amygdala, you have two on either side, and that thing gets activated and it shuts down to some degree the the front part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, where things like discernment and wisdom and empathy and emotional regulation happen. And so when something that is disturbing you, something that your brain kind of signals that there's something potentially dangerous, the fear center gets activated before the thinking center.
Hmm.
And so learning how to be able to calm yourself enough to have an exploratory, it's usually not a bear running at us, it's usually a human being that has a different viewpoint. And we're not
Hmm.
really being threatened life or death. And yet, but our brain tells us we are, unless we can overcome that. Another thing that I think uh, is um, is really important that I learned. I mean, just like was like a revelation when I learned it, was that the brain, through either not having secure attachment, not having loving, trustworthy parents growing up, or maybe even abusive or neglecting parents, um, doesn't hook your brain up right. It basically, there's a disintegration, and trauma can disintegrate your brain as well. And so there's a dysfunction in your brain that happens that makes it hard to relate with people or God. And there is a path of healing that is very simple. And this blew my mind. So your brain can literally be reintegrated and healed on a physical level, can be healed by being listened to compassionately.
Hmm. Okay.
It hooks things up. It's almost like you get the parenting that you didn't get through another person.
Okay. All right. It, what does that look like in your practice? How do people who might say, "Well, I don't know who to speak to. Where's the compassionate listener in my life?" How do you enter into that?
Well, there's a number of ways. I went out and hired a compassionate listener, and I speak to, I have two people, I speak to a therapist every month. I speak to a life coach every month. And I have pastor colleagues and friends. Um, so you may have to go find one. And it bothers me that it's cost prohibitive for many people. But a pastor is a solution as well. But you might have a friend that you trust, for instance. And like I have multiple friends that I do this with. We talk every week or often, and one of us begins by tell me about how you're doing, and we don't swap stories. We just one listens while the other talks, reflectively. We don't, we ask questions, and then the other one takes a turn. And so, we don't interrupt each other. We don't, again, we don't share the story that we're burning to tell because you told me that story. We're just listening to one another. So listening, being a good listener and finding a good listener is a way to participate in growing each other's spiritual intelligence.
Hmm. Are there other practical steps that people can take to deepen their spiritual intelligence?
Absolutely. So, the book outlines 9 different paths that you can work on that, building, growing in these 9 identified things that came out of my research. And I'll just throw out a few. One, with God, we've got learning to trust God, which is easier said than done.
Hmm.
Maybe the easier one to focus on is communication with God. So learning, not just praying, not just expressing yourself to God, but learning to hear God in some way. I mean, that's some next level stuff to be able to experience God communicating to you in some way. And I've got exercises in the book for that. A big one is forgiveness, learning to receive and give forgiveness. I mean, without forgiveness, it's just like we're plumbing that's stuck, like that's clogged. And until we're able to forgive ourselves or receive forgiveness or forgive another person, then God's love doesn't get in, God's love doesn't get out. And so that one single practice, though, is a daunting practice for many people. That one practice can make the biggest difference in your ability to receive and give love to other people.
Mm. I want to backtrack for just a moment in talking about the aspect of prayer. I've talked with several people who feel like, well, I talk to God. I don't know if God is listening, though, because I don't hear God talking back. When you're talking about God listening for God, what does that look like? How do we hear God?
Yeah. Well, I think it takes, we won't hear or see what we can't believe. So it's very hard, so you have to, in some level, open yourself up to the possibility of it. Like, I might be able to see God doing something today, but it takes also imagination. And not imagination is like you're making something up, but imagination like, you know, I'll give you an example. So I was having one of those days and I just threw it out to God. I'm like, God, I don't even know what to say, but could you say something to me right now? And that kind of inner voice said, keep your eyes open. And so I was driving in my car and I saw a sign, and the sign, it was Campbell Road. And I'm like, Campbell, okay. My daughter's name is Campbell. And then the very next thing I saw was Nelson's Steakhouse. And I'm like, that's my son. I've got Campbell, I've got Nelson. And then lo and behold, La Hacienda Ranch House Restaurant. It was the very place where my wife and I had our rehearsal dinner before the day before we got married. And then it was all came together in this moment. I heard God saying to me, what are you worried about? Do you remember when you had blown your previous marriage and you begged me for a wife that would be a good match for you? And I gave you Jennifer. And there it is right there where it happened. And remember when you prayed for children, you struggled for years to have children. And then finally the solution of adoption came up and boom, there was Nelson. And then boom, there was Campbell. What makes you think that I'm going to leave you stranded today? So I would call that some combination of faith, openness, and imagination.
Yeah, okay. I can see the correlation there, although it does help to have some literal signs popping into the story as well.
Those who have eyes to see, ears to hear, Jesus said.
Some of the work that you've been sharing through the book deals a lot with empathy. You've mentioned how we can begin to disarm our fear a bit by talking and relating with people. And yet that even in of itself can be fear-inducing for many people, especially in the kind of national season that we're in right now. And we're recording this a couple weeks before the election Tuesday. So that idea of being able to relate with some people is on the top of people's minds, and it feels somewhat fearful. Can spiritual intelligence help us to open up some relationships with other people or open ourselves up to empathy with others?
Absolutely. And that's part of the big goal of what I'm doing is try to open people's empathy up for other people. And there's unhealthy empathy. I want to say that first of all. There's codependent empathy that is really about transaction and getting what you need from others or controlling them to get what you need, manipulation. And empathy can be used in unhealthy ways. But so that aside, we were evolutionarily raised as a species to become in a tribe, that we developed to be in tribes for safety, for provision, and things like that. And so this is deep in our brain and it just in our DNA. And so for survival's sake, we learned empathy with the people that are in our tribe. And then for survival's sake, we learned to feel threatened with people that are not in our tribe. And so that's very deep instinctual stuff in human beings and hard to overcome.
Hmm.
So, the one of the solutions of that is trying to expand the potential for common identity. So, yeah, okay, one may be a Democrat, one may be a Republican, but we're both Americans, or, if all else fails, we're both human beings. But maybe you both like barbecue, maybe you both like the same kind of music, but anytime you can find some common ground to move them from the out group to the in group of your life, you can find empathy. That doesn't mean that you should then give up all that you believe to please another person. That's codependency again. But you find a connecting point, and then you can have a conversation, an exchange of ideas, perspectives, being able to see people's perspectives rather than just your own perspective projected on them is a big part of empathy.
Well, we've seen how spirituality relates to intelligence. The organization that you founded is called Soul Metrics. You seem to be very talented in working with these kind of paradoxical words because soul and measurement are things that don't naturally go together. Tell us about Soul Metrics.
Thank you. Yeah. My wife came up with the phrase, by the way, so I'll give
Cool.
credit. But yeah, no, I'm of course dealing with the soul. But yeah, when I proposed my thesis to my advisor, who was a clinical psychologist, by the way, when I proposed it to him, I said, "Look, I've got this theory of spiritual intelligence, a Christ-centered spiritual intelligence, and I'm trying to put together an experiment, a project here to display how it works. But I need an instrument of measurement so people could take it in the beginning and in the end. So some way of measuring spiritual intelligence." And he said, "That would be great, Paul. Why don't you do that?" I'm like, well, I can think of a million reasons. One being, I have no idea how to create a psychometrically sound assessment. And I'm sure I didn't say those words because I didn't know what those words were. But he said, but I know how to do it. And so he worked with me. And what I did was develop an instrument of measurement for spiritual intelligence, and val- validate it with over 700 participants who took the initial questionnaire, and then we refined it based on all the metrics and data and things like that, statistical data. So people are very hesitant to put metrics on spirituality. And so let me just say, we're not measuring God. You cannot measure God, right? But you can, and people have been measuring the human response to the world for decades. There's a ton of assessments that are out there that are valid. And so this isn't so much measuring God, it is measuring what impact your belief or lack of belief in God and your ability to love or not love self and love neighbor or not love neighbor. How can that be detected? And it can be. Turns out you can do that in a psychological way.
Tell me a little bit more. What does that look like? Like, if I take the test and I get a 9, does that mean I'm pretty close to God? Not
Yeah.
quite 10 close to God, but
Well, we do. It's a hundred scale, but and so it's measuring, you know, these 9 areas that are talked about in the book, and the score can be a little disturbing because we're we're not usually as I don't want to say spiritual. It's just that we've got these interferences in us. If we have resentments, if we have hurts, and if we have codependency, if we struggle to believe that God is a good God and a loving God, a personal God, then all those things impact. And it's really geared towards measuring your your level of secure attachment with God. So it's an attachment measurement, and your level of self-differentiation, which is the opposite of codependency, and your level of empathy. So those three major areas of measurement together. And then, so you get a score, and then you and I have a conversation, and we talk about how you answered the questions and why you answered them how you are, and we get to the deeper ground. It's not really about the assessment at all. It's a way of having a conversation to get to the deeper ground of the state of our souls.
And what kind of responses do you hear in people who are taking the test and beginning the process?
Yeah, well, some people will say it's about what I thought, and then they'll tell me why. And some people will say it felt like a punch in the gut. And the reason, is an unfortunate reason, is because that things spiritual have become shame-inducing for many people. And so, for instance, if you went to your medical doctor, your primary physician, you wouldn't tell them how good you're doing. You would tell them what's wrong with you. But if you go to your pastor or your spouse or your best friend, and you're dealing with a deeply spiritual, emotional problem, you might be afraid to talk about it. And if you're afraid to talk about it, then there's no real way to move forward with it. And so really, I want to very quickly try to lower the shame part, to de-shamify spirituality and get it into a level that's a little more clinical, so that we can work with it.
How do you lower that barrier of shame?
Say that again.
How do you lower that barrier of shame?
Yeah. Well, I'll often begin in this conversation, and I'll often begin by, saying this has nothing to do with the destination of your soul. This is not heaven or hell conversation, because that's a big factor for a lot of people. And say this is also not how you always are. This is a point of time assessment. This is how you are on a Friday, right? You might be going through grief. You might have experienced a trauma that hasn't been fully dealt with. You might have an unforgiveness that has been eating at you. It could be something, that happened yesterday, 10 years ago, or 30 years ago, but it's how you are today. And then I'll begin to look at the strengths of their assessment to say, but you've got some strong areas here to lean into as you begin to deal with areas that need to be addressed.
Paul, thank you for the work that you're doing, for encouraging people in the way that you are. For those who are interested in learning more about the work that you're up to, where might they get a hold of you?
Well, my website is soul-metrics.com. You can fill out the contact form there. You can email me at revpaulburns, R-E-V Paul Burns @gmail.com as well. And I'd be glad to talk to you with whatever you're working on. Because I do also pastoring 2 churches, so just know that my time is a little limited in that sense, but I do want to hear from anybody that has a question. I have a network of 25 trained coaches that I refer people out to that are trained in the GPS assessment, and so you're going to get some help from somewhere. Or you could just read the book, which has kind of all of this outlined.
Cool. Yep. The book is Becoming Spiritually Intelligent. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Good to meet you.
Likewise. Do you want to hear more Compass? If this episode struck a chord with you, then check out episode number 137 with Bruce Reyes-Chow about crafting a clarity of belief. Episode 134 with Andrew Lang would also be a good one. It's about creating spiritual practices that are going to fit into our busy everyday lives. And while you're listening, please leave a rating and/or review. It's a big help. It would be so much appreciated. The Compass Podcast is brought to you by United Methodist Communications, and you can check out all of our episodes and get show notes and relevant links at umc.org/compass. That's all for this week. We're going to be back in 2 weeks' time with a new episode. In the meantime, peace.